All right, welcome back to another episode of the Always Adaptive podcast. I'm your host, Randall James. I'm a strength and I'm a running coach. And today's topic is a doozy of a topic. We're talking about seed oils. Now, what my hope is, what you'll get out of this is that this is sort of the end all be all videos, the only video you really need to form your opinion on seed oils. What I'm planning to do here is to steelman both the argument against seed oils and the argument for seed oils. And what motivated me to do this was I just saw Tim Pool's podcast where we had on Dr. Robert Malone, and they talked about all kinds of different things, but they started to touch on the topic of seed oils. And so just so you can get a sense of where I'm gonna go with this, I'm gonna play a short clip from that podcast and then we'll go from there.
If those McDonald's products are using, let's say, seed oils in their manufacturing that is associated with health risks that are, above and beyond the call, and they don't have to do those things, does the state have the right to say, no, we're not going to allow you to use seed oils? Now, I'm not advocating that position right now, but I'm making the point.
Can I ask about seed oils, though? Do you have a position on seed oils?
Absolutely. Seed oils, I'm convinced, are a major driver in our obesity crisis.
What is the mechanism for that?
It has to do with their metabolism or absence of metabolism and the storage of the fatty product, to the best of my knowledge. I'm not an expert on it.
So that right there is a perfect example of someone who's very qualified. I mean, he is a doctor. Dr. Robert Malone is very well known. And yet, when he's asked about a specific mechanism about a topic that he has a very strong opinion about, I mean, when he asked him, "Can I ask you about seed oils?" He was very definitive about what his stance was. He's anti-seed oils, and he did not hesitate whatsoever. But when he's asked what the mechanism is, he does not have an answer. And this is very common today, where you have doctors, dietitians, nutritionists, people of all different walks of life, very qualified people, research scientists that are just definitively saying seed oils are bad, and they don't say why. And of course, you know me, I need nuance. They don't have any nuance in their opinion. So what I'm here to deliver is that nuance. So again, I'm going to steelman both the case against seed oils. I'm going to steelman the case for seed oils, and then I'm going to provide my stance at the end of this. Now, just as I've said in other videos on different topics, this is not a hill that I'm willing to die on. You'll figure out what hill I'm talking about. And of course, there's always going to be new information that comes out. There's way more information today on seed oils than there was 20 years ago. And so as things continue to evolve and as culture changes and we put more pressure on regulatory agencies and food companies, food manufacturers, things change. Companies start to use different products, things start to get banned, better science comes out. And so who knows, in 5 years, there could be even more data than we have now. But I'm basing my opinion on all of this based off of what we have now. This is going to go deep on some mechanism. There's going to be some studies. And so if all of that is just too much and you want the TLDR, just scroll. I'll have the chapters marked. You can go to the end and hear my perspective on it. And if you're curious about any individual point, because it is a long perspective, I'm not just making one statement and throwing it out there. It's a nuanced take at the end of this. So if you're ever curious about any one piece of my take at the end, then you can go through and scrub the chapters and see which one really interests you the most. But with that being said, let's get into it. I'm going to start off laying out the arguments against seed oils and for seed oils, not going deep, but just laying out all of the different arguments. We're going to start off with anti-seed oils. So the main point that is commonly argued is that seed oils are made out of polyunsaturated fatty acids, which are prone to oxidation. Now, this oxidation it doesn't just come from heat. Everyone commonly cites heat. You can overheat them and make them oxidized. But also mechanical stress. A good analogy or a good example you could think of is red blood cells being forced through a narrow artery. If someone has atherosclerosis, cardiovascular disease, and they have red blood cells being forced through a narrow artery, those red blood cells might sustain more damage along the way as they scrape up and bump up against things if their cell membranes are composed of omega-6 fatty acids, polyunsaturated fats. And that goes into the next point for this steelman against seed oils, is that polyunsaturated fatty acids do get incorporated into the cell membrane of cells. And so the same damage that you're talking about in terms of the oxidized fatty acids as you're intaking them, that same damage can actually occur to your cells themselves. So that's not good. Point number three is hexane. So you may or may not have heard of hexane. It's a chemical solvent that's used to increase the yield. It dissolves fat. So if you have the seed, you get the fat out of the seed. The hexane dissolves the fat and improves the oil yield. The problem with this is that while this chemical compound is regulated, it is 100% neurotoxin. And in fact, there are limits on how much you can actually be exposed to in the air. Let's say if you have a job where there's commonly hexane in the air, there are limits across an 8 hour workday. And so the argument here would be that you would find hexane, traces of hexane in the seed oils that people are consuming. Again, I'm not going deep just yet, but we're going to get into that. We're going to go in depth on that. We also have correlation with chronic disease. So people like to cite studies where they'll show graphs lined up and it'll show the obesity graph, or it'll show the increase in the number of chronic conditions, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, all these other things, and it'll line it up with the same graph showing an increase in polyunsaturated fat, seed oils of all different types. And then that also goes into the obesity point. So those are all the points that I'm going to go deep on in terms of the Steelman against seed oils. Now we're going to go into the Steelman for pro seed oil. And again, just going through these really quickly. Linoleic acid, which is an omega-6 fatty acid, is an essential fatty acid. So just like with protein, how you have essential amino acids, and those amino acids, you have to get them from the diet, you have essential fatty acids as well. And that's very much the same. You have to get these from diet. And so linoleic acid is a great source of omega-6 fatty acids for people that eat plants. So someone's not always going to be, there are tons of vegans and vegetarians out there that don't eat animal products. And so they need alternative sources of getting their linoleic acid, their essential fatty acids. And so plants can be a good benefiter for that. Number two, we have studies. So there are a lot of studies on seed oils, and the large scale studies don't show any sort of clear harm. And in fact, there are studies that show benefit specifically in the realm of cardiovascular disease. So it's not as black and white as people make it out to seem. This is why mechanisms, while they're important and you can have a theory, it doesn't mean anything if the outcome that you're powering for isn't there. You could have all the mechanisms in the world, but if you're looking at what is the end result and it's completely different than what you think it is, then your mechanism doesn't really matter all that much now, does it? So the next point is that not all seed oils oxidize the same. Like there are high oleic seed oils, which would be like an omega-9 fatty acid, and we're going to get into the whole omega system later. But high oleic seed oils are way more stable than an omega-3 or an omega-6 fatty acid. Also, you don't always have to cook at very high temperatures. So if we exclude the fact that these oils are heated before they get to you, because there are alternatives to that as well, then as long as you're not cooking at ridiculously high temperatures all the time, then you can largely bypass that. The last thing is that there are expeller cold pressed seed oils. And this, I've actually been seeing a trend. So this is where culture is important, where you have people bringing it to the forefront, talking about these issues. And now you have issues, companies like Pam, which is one of the biggest, I think, manufacturers of oil cooking sprays. And I was just at the grocery store, the whole top shelf that's full of Pam, right on the front of the bottle, it says expeller pressed oil. So there are changes happening. So as long as we keep communicating, these companies will change. If we express our dissatisfaction with how things are going, I mean, that's the beauty of capitalism, right? Whoever, if a population expresses their dissatisfaction with something, and then another company swoops in and makes the desired changes, that company is going to make a fortune. If the main company, which we'll just pretend it's Pam right now, if they stay the same and they don't change with the culture, then they're going to get left behind. People aren't going to buy that product. So you can vote for issues with your dollar. And I think seeing Pam putting expeller pressed on the front of their bottles or their cans is a really good sign of things to come. The next point is omega-6 does not always equal inflammation. And there are RCTs that directly look at that, where they look at increased levels of linoleic acid and inflammatory markers. And there's no lineup. It's not conclusive where an increased intake of LA equals increased inflammatory markers like CRP or tumor necrosis alpha, and all these other things. The next point is hexane exposure is negligible. Now, this one, again, this isn't me staking my position just yet. This is me just steel manning the case for seed oils. I'm going to get into why this isn't exactly telling the whole truth, but hexane is regulated by these different bodies. But the FDA in America is different than some of the regulatory bodies in the rest of the country, in the rest of the world. So we can't just hang our hat on this, on the statement that hexane exposure is negligible, and I'll get into why. And the last point is that seed oils are affordable. Now, I already talked about how if you're vegan or vegetarian and you're not getting animal sources of these omega-6 fatty acids or omega-3 fatty acids, then you need to get them from seed oils. And so that's one part of it. And the last point is that seed oils are affordable and accessible. Now, I've already got into why it's important for vegan vegetarians because of their lack of animal products. But the other piece of this is that seed oils are cheaper than a lot of animal products. So you have things called food deserts in various parts of the country. And typically these are impoverished areas of the country where people don't make that much money, but they also don't have access to farmers markets and fresh meats and fresh fruits and vegetables. And so, I mean, this is something, again, you have to take, this requires nuance, right? Because there are people out there that are not as lucky as you or I may be and have access to these foods. So in order for them to get these essential fatty acids, they might have to rely a bit more on processed foods than you or I might. Now, I'm not saying that that's right. Again, this isn't me staking my position on this. I'm just kind of making the point pro seed oil. Now, we got that all out of the way. We're going to go deep on this. Now, again, if this starts to get too dry for you, you can skip ahead to the end and you can get my take on all of this. So we're going to take this point by point and we're going to go deep on it. So the first point, what I mentioned before, the seed oils are highly unsaturated, which means they're prone to oxidation. Why is that? So first we need to talk about the omega system. There's the omega system and the delta system, and this largely refers to which end of the carbon chain you're counting from. Without going too deep on that, I'm just going to stick to the omega system because I'm pretty sure most of you would understand that there's omega-3, omega-6, omega-9 fatty acids. So what does that number correspond to? That number corresponds to the starting double bond on the carbon chain. So I want you to imagine you have a methyl group and you have a carboxyl group. And in between that, you have a bunch of carbons. Omega-3, the third carbon in, you will have a double bond. Now, what is that double bond? The double bond represents a kink or a bend, or you could say it's a weak point in the carbon chain. That makes it susceptible to mechanical damage and heat damage. So you often hear people talk about heat damage, but they never tell you why. And it's due to these double bonds. Saturated fat does not have any double bonds. Polyunsaturated fat, poly means they do. So on omega-3s, depending on the length of the carbon chain, because you have short chain, medium chain, long chain fatty acids, for omega-6, it would be the first double bond would be on the 6th position, and omega-9, obviously, it would be on the 9th position. There are all kinds of different fats, so I'm not going to go too deep on every single type of fat. I'm going to put up a picture and show you all of the different ones. Now, this shows you the unsaturated fats to start with, the types of omega-3, omega-6, omega-9, the name of the fatty acid, how many carbons each one has, and how many double bonds. And you can see that omega-3 DHA has 22 carbons and 6 double bonds. So because it has 6 double bonds, there are 6 weak points along the chain of carbons. And then if we go down to omega-6, where we look at omega-6 linoleic acid has 18 carbons and only 2 double bonds. So because it only has 2 weak points, it is more stable than the omega-3 DHA. Now let's look at saturated fats. All of these different saturated fats, obviously they have different carbon lengths, but there's 0 double bonds. So all of these would be more stable than any of the unsaturated fats that I showed on the other table. Now, what happens to these double bonds? Well, if they sustain any sort of damage, let's just talk about it in terms of dietary fat, not getting to the cell membrane point just yet. So you eat some fat, that dietary fat has already oxidized. Let's say we have 2 different circumstances. We have it's already oxidized before it even gets in your body, or you heated it and that made it oxidize. So you're eating these oxidized fats. Your body reacts to these damaged fats. It treats them very much so like an injury. So you eat these fats, they're floating around in your blood, and your immune system is triggered, and your body starts to send out white blood cells, macrophages, neutrophils. They have different actions where macrophages are kind of long term and neutrophils are short lived. So like the neutrophils would be like the first responders, and the macrophages would be the backup, the support system. So you have these white blood cells that go through and they attack what they've identified to be a threat, and this starts to create foam cells. You've probably heard of foam cells. So this is where I'm going to tie this into the cell membrane point, where you have these fatty acids. I had mentioned the methyl group and the carboxyl group. So the methyl group is always going to be, if you think about your cell membrane, it has a lipid bilayer, meaning it's two rows of lipids stacked on top of each other. The heads are always facing away from each other. The tails are always facing towards each other. The tails are the methyl group. The heads are the carboxyl group. So we're starting to count from the methyl group. So for omega-3, that represents the third carbon in from the methyl group, or the tail. Now, imagine if most of those lipids are comprised of polyunsaturated fat. Let's say someone's eating a diet that's really high in polyunsaturated fat. Well, the dietary fat starts to get incorporated into that lipid bilayer. So let's talk about high blood pressure in relation to this. Someone has high blood pressure. The blood is being squeezed through narrower arteries, just as an example. The lipid bilayer of the cells that the blood is reacting with is damaging that from mechanical stresses, no longer heat stress. And so what you end up with is the same immune response that I was talking about from the dietary fats floating around in your bloodstream. That same immune response happens to your body now, because those lipid bilayers are being damaged. Your immune system, your white blood cells identify that as a threat, and they go there and they try to fix it, essentially. And so the foam cells that would naturally be floating around in your blood, they're now building up on the damaged part of your cells themselves. And these foam cells create plaques, and this is how you get the hardening of the arteries. This is an atherogenic environment. So this is very important to know this, because your cells are constantly, your cell membranes are constantly being turned over. It's not as though once they have their cell membrane, they have it for life. There's constant turnover, and different parts of the body are turned over quicker than others. So that's sort of the mechanism of how omega-6 fatty acids, polyunsaturated fats, wreak havoc in the body, both from diet and also once they become incorporated into your cell membrane. Now we're going to talk about hexane. So as I mentioned before, hexane is a chemical solvent that's used to dissolve fats for greater yields during processing. After extraction, the companies will heat the oils to burn off the hexane. So this is their way of getting rid of it, so that they can ensure that you're not eating hexane. And it is a fact that hexane is a toxin. There's no debate there. This is concerning because when they're heating it to burn off the hexane, the mechanisms that I already talked about, you end up with an issue where they are oxidizing the fats themselves just by trying to get rid of the toxin. So they're trading one toxin for another toxin, essentially. This also is a double whammy, because oftentimes these oils are heated again during food manufacturing, and then also during when you're cooking them. So a lot of baked goods, cookies, biscuits, muffins, pastries, all this stuff, during the manufacturing of that processed sweet or treat or whatever itself, it is heated. Like, it's just like baking a cake, right? Like if you have a biscuit, you have to bake that. So it undergoes heating. And then also, if you're cooking with certain products, if you cook them at home, you're also heating them again. So that's one issue. The other issue is the hexane still in the food? Now, the FDA claims that dietary levels are safe, but that's not telling the whole story, as we're going to get into here. But even if no hexane remains, the fact that the oils are being heat treated to get rid of the hexane is very concerning. Now, we're going to talk about a technical report that was released by the European Food Safety Authority. This was a report that concluded that a reevaluation of the safety of technical hexane used as an extraction solvent in food production is necessary. This conclusion was based on several factors, including outdated toxicological data, potential exposure levels in vulnerable populations, and the need for updated specifications for technical hexane's composition and impurities. The report highlighted that the previous assessment assessment by the Scientific Committee on Food in 1996 may no longer be sufficient given advancements in scientific standards and methodologies. Additionally, EFSA noted that exposure assessments indicated that infants, toddlers, and other children might have higher exposure levels than previously considered. Furthermore, the report emphasized the absence of detailed specifications for technical hexane, particularly concerning its constituents and potential impurities which could transfer to food during extraction. As a result, EFSA recommended a comprehensive reevaluation to ensure consumer safety, considering current scientific knowledge and data. Now, as far as I'm concerned, they're at the forefront of this. They are pushing to reevaluate all of this and check, because most of the studies, well, I think all of the studies that everyone's basing their decisions off of in terms of hexane and all this stuff, it's rodent studies. Now, that's not to say that rodent studies are useless. It's just like the red dye ban that was in rodent studies, and that showed that the red dye was causing tumors to form in rodents. However, as we are advancing, that's what this is talking about, there are advancements in science. We need to keep up with that and keep testing these products. Now, the other issue is that the US does not even have a limit on hexane like the EU does. And there are studies out there that will check the amount of hexane in various popular oils, cooking oils and such. But the big one that people like to cite, that was done in Iran. And the United States is totally different. Just like in Europe and just like in Canada, their cereals and stuff, they like the EU has tons of banned chemicals that we still use. And just like with the Fruit Loops, how Canada was using fruits and carrots and stuff to color their Fruit Loops, meanwhile the US is using artificial dyes. So this is a huge regulatory blind spot, and I think this needs to be fixed immediately. We need to have a lot of large scale studies done to actually check how much hexane is in the oil that's on the shelf in the United States. And this needs to be done as quickly as possible, because the fact that the EU enforces strict limits and the US doesn't, that really bothers me a little bit. It's kind of sketchy if you think about it. And it's not me saying that it's intentional, but why is that? Why would our FDA not enforce limit on a known neurotoxin that is widely found in the foods that we're eating in the first place? Now let's talk about the essential fatty acid angle. So like I said, essential amino acids you need to get them from diet. Your body doesn't make them. Same thing for fatty acids. So people argue that seed oils are a great way of doing this. However, you can find these essential fatty acids in animal products. So you don't always need to use seed oils to get these. In fact, omega-3, DHA, and EPA, you're far better off getting that from animal products as opposed to ALA from plants. It's going to be converted much better from the animal sources. And then arachidonic acid, which comes from omega-6, you're going to find that in meat and eggs. So you don't need to convert it from seed oils. Now, this kind of neglects the vegan vegetarian argument, and that's, it is what it is. If you're going to skip out on animal products, then unfortunately, you're going to miss out on some of the benefits that animal products have to give, both from a fatty acid angle and then also from a micronutrient angle. So now let's steel man the case for seed oils. Going back to that essential fatty acid argument, not everyone eats enough animal products to meet their essential fat needs. Now, again, this goes back to food deserts and impoverished areas. These people don't have access to a lot of high quality animal products, which is a shame, but it stays nonetheless. Pro 2, this is the big one. I don't want to spend too much time on the essential fatty acid argument because I've beaten that to death. But in favor of seed oils, studies. So studies are always going to be, you have this hypothesis. Does the data actually show that? So I'm going to talk about 3 studies. So the first study is entitled Biomarkers of Dietary Omega-6 Fatty Acids and Incident Cardiovascular Disease and Mortality. Now, in this study, I'm not going to go deep on this. We don't really have time for that, but I'm just going to talk about some of the findings that they had. So basically, they were looking at the total linoleic acid levels in varying measures. So they looked at cholesterol esters, they looked at plasma and adipose tissue, and they looked at different acids, so linoleic acid and arachidonic acid. So linoleic acid overall was associated with a slight reduction in total cardiovascular disease risk with a hazard ratio of 0.93, meaning a 7% decrease. Cholesterol esters, LA had the strongest association with lower cardiovascular disease, the hazard ratio of 0.74. And in plasma and adipose tissue, there was no significant association. Now moving on to arachidonic acid, overall, AA was not significantly associated with cardiovascular disease risk with a hazard ratio of 0.95. Now, that's a 5% reduction, but because it crosses 1, that means it's not statistically significant. Total plasma, AA showed a potential benefit with a hazard ratio of 0.81, and the confidence interval does not cross 1. So that's what I'm talking about. You can see the ratio there is 0.7 to 0.94. And because it doesn't cross 1, that is statistically significant. Statistical significance in terms of this confidence ratio is if it's below 1, that means there's a reduction risk. If the whole range is above 1, then that means there's an increase. And if it's both below and above 1, then that means it's not statistically significant. Now let's talk about cardiovascular disease mortality risk. Linoleic acid, overall, higher LA levels were associated with a significant 22% lower risk of cardiovascular disease mortality, hazard ratio of 0.78. Cholesterol esters, strongest reduction with a hazard ratio of 0.56. That's a huge reduction. And when it was measured in plasma and adipose tissue, there was a similar reduction, hazard ratio of 0.66. Arachidonic AA was not significantly associated with cardiovascular disease mortality, hazard ratio of 0.94. But again, because the confidence interval crosses 1, barely, it's not statistically significant. And then in terms of total coronary heart disease risk, overall, LA showed a borderline significant reduction in coronary heart disease risk, just at the borderline there with the confidence interval. And when measured in cholesterol esters, that was the most significant benefit with a hazard ratio of 0.78, and plasma and adipose tissue with no significant associations. Overall, arachidonic acid was not associated with coronary heart disease risk with a hazard ratio of 0.99, not statistically significant because it crosses 1. Ischemic stroke risk. So overall, higher LA levels were associated with lower risk of ischemic stroke. Cholesterol esters, strongest reduction. Plasma and adipose tissue, no significant associations. Arachidonic acid, overall, AA was not significantly associated with ischemic stroke risk. 0.9 to 1.10. That's the confidence interval. Crosses 1, not statistically significant. So you're seeing the trend with the study. It's either no effect or it's a benefit when it comes to cardiovascular disease. Now let's talk about this other study. This is entitled The Effect of Replacing Saturated Fat with Mostly Omega-6 Polyunsaturated Fat on Coronary Heart Disease, a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. Now, this one I like because randomized controlled trials, these are not observational studies. These are well-controlled studies where they actually go in and they try to measure the amount of fat or even provide diets for these people to follow. Now, they did this a few different ways. They separated into groups in terms of well-controlled trials and then trials where they weren't so well-controlled, and then also including all trials, lower quality and well-controlled. So we're going to just talk about the well-controlled trials because that's obviously stronger evidence. So when analyzing only the best quality, well-controlled trials, replacing saturated fat with omega-6 PUFA did not significantly affect major coronary heart disease events, total coronary heart disease events, mortality, and total mortality. Now, this one's a little interesting because the confidence interval obviously crosses 1 for all of these, meaning not. However, it crosses 1 so much in favor of an increased risk of coronary heart disease mortality. You can see the third one down, 1.40. That's a pretty large increase, but because, they say it crosses 1, it's not statistically significant, but it's still sort of significant. It depends. If it just barely crosses 1, it's not such a big deal, but if it crosses 1 by a large margin, that's a bit more significant than they would like to make it out to seem. So cautiously optimistic about this data is sort of how I take it, where it's like, okay, there's no effect, but there might be. Who knows? But again, we have to look at the totality of data. It's not like, oh, you see this one study and it's like well over 1, meaning increased risk, and you take that as your end all be all. It's like, no, basically all the studies, especially the ones I'm going to go over, show an improvement in risk, which is pretty important. So the last study we're going to talk about is entitled Omega-3, Omega-6, and Total Dietary Polyunsaturated Fat for Prevention and Treatment of Type 2 Diabetes mellitus, a systematic review and meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. So this was 83 randomized controlled trials, and total participant count was 58,643. The key findings is that long-chain omega-3s, EPA, and DHA do not significantly affect diabetes risk. Relative risk of 1, confidence interval 0.85 to 1.17. Now, means it's not statistically significant regardless of whatever the risk ratio is. Little to no effect on glucose metabolism markers, HbA1c, plasma glucose, and fasting insulin. Potential negative effects at high doses over 4.4 grams a day of long-chain omega-3s showed a suggestion of negative outcomes, but this was not fully confirmed. Omega-6, alpha linoleic acid, and total PUFA effects are unclear. Evidence quality is very low for how omega-6 and total PUFA affects diabetes risk. However, increasing ALA intake plant-based omega-3s may increase fasting insulin by around 7%, which could indicate a mild effect on insulin regulation. No strong evidence that omega-3 omega-6 ratio matters for diabetes or glucose metabolism. And that lends itself to this idea that we should have a higher ratio of omega-3 to omega-6. You will have more omega-6, but it's just people like to say that how much omega-3 you should have in comparison to omega-6 should be higher. But this is saying that ratio doesn't really matter for diabetes or glucose metabolism. And who knows for inflammation, but we're going to get into that. So let's talk about the next pro seed oil point. This point is that not all seed oils oxidize equally. High oleic seed oils, which would be like your omega-9 fatty acids, while yes, it does have a double bond at the 9th position, that's what the 9 means, it only has one double bond. So it's not as unstable as omega-6 or an omega-3 fatty acids. So those are seed oils that you can keep an eye out for at the grocery store. They will literally say high oleic, blah, blah, blah. Either on the front, or you can look at the ingredients on the back and find that it'll say high oleic, whatever seed that they got it from. So that's an oil that, it's not all seed oils are created equally. If you can find alternatives, then you should. And this goes into the point that smoke point is not the only factor in oil stability. You have to think like the temperature that you're cooking at is going to affect all kinds of different fats. I am largely an advocate for not like superheating the food that you're eating, like cooking it at ridiculously high temperatures. Another thing to think about is if you're putting oil or butter or anything into a pan that's already heated and you hear that the sizzle, that's much different than putting the oil in the pan first and then letting it come up to a temperature. Like if I'm cooking scrambled eggs and I already have the pan coated in oil and I let it heat up to a temperature that I'm going to cook eggs at, there's much less risk of that oil becoming oxidized than if I preheat the pan and then put the oil in and it comes to temperature very quickly. So that matters. Also, proper storage. So another thing that you can look out for is because light also oxidizes these oils, you want to look for cans and containers that are not clear glass. Like a lot of oil you'll find on the shelf is in a clear glass bottle. That's not good, especially who knows how long it's been sitting there just being exposed to light. And also temperature. Like when you get your seed oils, you don't want to just have them, like oftentimes I'll go to someone's house and I'll see their cooking oil sitting right next to their stove. And you got to think when you're cooking, you're heating your stove up and that oil is being heated up too. And if you have one of these highly oxidizable oils, then that's going to be a problem. That should be left in a dark, cool shelf where it's not going to be exposed to that stuff. And then, as I already mentioned, there are expeller pressed seed oils that you can buy too. So if you look for that on the front of the container that you're buying, then you don't have to worry about a lot of this other stuff that everyone's talking about in terms of the hexane, in terms of it already being heated by the time it gets to you, with the exception of baked goods, baked biscuits, and pastries and such. That's something to take into account. And so the next pro seed oil point is that omega-6 does not always equal inflammation and obesity. So we already talked about how studies show that there is actually a reduction in harm sometimes, or there's just a low quality evidence. It's not statistically significant if it does even show a slight increase, and that's always what it is. It's a slight increase and the ratio always crosses 1, so that's important. But the body tightly regulates the conversion of linoleic acid into arachidonic acid, meaning more linoleic acid does not always equal arachidonic acid. If you don't remember, arachidonic acid has the most double bonds, meaning it's the most unstable oil. So just to back that up, we're going to talk about this study, effect of dietary linoleic acid on markers of inflammation in healthy persons, a systematic review of randomized controlled trials, and this is out of the Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. How was the study conducted? The researchers searched Medline, Cochrane Controlled Trials Register, and Embase for relevant studies, only including randomized controlled trials, making this a high-quality review. For the inclusion criteria, studies had to focus on healthy non-infant populations, and they had to measure biological markers of inflammation, CRP and cytokines. 15 studies met the inclusion criteria. Key findings. None of the 15 studies found significant increases in inflammatory markers, including C-reactive protein, fibrinogen, plasminogen, cytokines, and soluble vascular adhesion molecules. 2 studies found minor biochemical changes, and these were higher prostaglandin. I have no idea what that is. I have not done my due diligence on that, so I don't know what that does. Lower thromboxane. I don't know what that is either. And then higher, I'm not even going to try and pronounce that word. And if you can say that really quickly, send me a message because I would love to hear you pronounce it. However, these changes were not linked to increased inflammation. I had a hard time finding any evidence in terms of looking at dietary linoleic acid, PUFAs, whatever, and looking at weight gain, because that is the other angle that people will take. Oh, well, dietary PUFAs they will be linked to weight gain, and they'll show the graph showing the increase of both of that. I did find this meta-analysis entitled The Effect of Different Edible Oils on Body Weight, a Systematic Review and Network Meta-Analysis of Randomized Controlled Trials. And this did show that some oils, when compared to others, did have an increase in weight, a significant increase in weight. However, there were also other oils that led to weight loss. So very inconsistent in terms of that. However, there were some major limits to this study in terms of energy intake reporting. Not all included studies specified energy intake. So that's how many calories you're intaking. If you don't control for that, then you really cannot use any sort of data that shows a weight loss or weight gain. You can't use it because you have to know how many calories they're intaking. Of course, if they're in a caloric surplus and then you're looking at the oil they're eating, they're in a caloric surplus, they're going to gain weight. If they're in a caloric deficit, and then they're going to lose weight. It's really that simple. So you have to control for that. Also, there was variability in macronutrient intake, and there was also variability in the method of the oil consumption in the first place. So were these people actually frying with these oils, or were these oils included in things like salad dressings and such? And that the method of delivery is extremely important because that's going to affect how many calories you're intaking. It also makes it harder for them to actually measure how much oil they're getting in the first place. I mean, I would argue borderline impossible. This goes to how people suck at reporting their amounts, especially with things like sauces and salad dressings and oil for cooking. I mean, this lends itself to the point I'm sure you've seen recently how the PAM sprays will say that one spray is 0 calories, but they're measuring that off of like a very short spritz. Like it's super short. You could barely even measure it. But most people are, they're spraying for a really long time. And so just because they say 0 calories does not mean that you are getting 0 calories. And I would argue that you're probably getting over 100 calories each time you spray the pan. So lastly, I want to talk about the hexane angle in favor of seed oils. So hexane extraction pulls significantly more seed oils than traditional methods, up to 99% more, a greater yield. So this is important because without processes like this, we have to farm more. So this is helping us feed more people off of a smaller amount of crop, which is important. Now, people would say that residual hexane is negligible, and in the EU, they have the 1 milligram per kilogram limit. But even without strict enforcements, levels in tested oils remain well below concerning thresholds. Now, I already made the point that some of the data that they use to say this, to make this statement, one of the studies was based in Iran. Now, again, the Food and Drug Administration does not currently monitor the amounts of hexane that you'll find in foods, but they have set limits for 2 products. And this is just interesting that they chose these: fish protein isolate, hexane residues must not exceed 5 parts per million, and hop extract and spice residues are limited to 25 parts per million. It's a little concerning that they're not monitoring, and that study being in Iran is, I mean, like, that gives me no relief. Iran's oils are going to be completely different than the oils that the United States uses. So this is a clear blind spot. And even though this is pro seed oils now that we're talking about, it's still extremely concerning. So I hope that I've laid out a proper steelman case for both anti-seed oils and pro seed oils. Now, what is my opinion? I think the base foundation of my opinion is that seed oils can be okay as long as they meet three criteria. They are expeller or cold pressed for extraction. That removes the need to heat treat it. So you're no longer removing the hexane. So one, that's going to reduce the hexane, and that's also going to reduce the risk of them being oxidized before they even reach you. Although not for all products, because again, you have to take into account biscuits, cookies, things of that nature. So better to just stay away from those things altogether. Number 2, they're either high oleic PUFAs or oils that are comprised of saturated fat. Again, saturated fat is highly stable. There are no double bonds, so you don't have to worry about those weak points, those double bond weak points that are susceptible to heat or mechanical damage. High oleic PUFAs, omega 9s, they have one double bond, which means still not as good as saturated fat, but better than omega 6 and omega 3. And number 3, they're in non transparent metal or glass containers, no plastics, no clear glasses. These oils are highly susceptible to light, being oxidized via light. So you have to look at that. And where they're stored matters a ton too. Now, that's not really something you can really control before it gets to you, but you can control that at your house. So keeping it in a cool, dark place, not keeping it right on your kitchen counter, especially if it's a clear glass bottle, and keeping it, even if it's not a clear glass bottle, keeping it right next to your stove where you're cooking, where a lot of heat is being produced. You do not want to be keeping your oils next to your stove, period. There are thoughts that high oleic and expeller pressed oils are not scalable. And I think that's false. As I've already stated, companies like PAM, who is arguably one of the largest oil product manufacturers on the market, they are advertising some of their oils as expeller press. And as I've already stated, as we continue to push culture and push these companies to do better, I do think that capitalism will push these companies to make the shift towards strictly expeller press. And maybe even they might start to use high oleic oils instead of the combination of 3, 6, and 9. Maybe they start to switch over to just 9. Who knows? But I think us putting pressure on these people is great. And I think we've seen a lot of positive changes just in a few short months. I think if someone's meeting these criteria, if the oils that someone's intaking are meeting these criteria, then the individual is largely safe. I think it's not something to worry about. I also think people need to remember the nocebo effect, just like the placebo effect. If you think something's beneficial, there's a large chance that it actually will be beneficial to you. The nocebo effect, if you think something is going to harm you, there is a large chance that it actually will harm you. So people are obsessing over a lot of this stuff right now. And I don't think it's beneficial to continually obsess about negative reactions to different foods, because you can drive yourself mad. And now all of a sudden you're limiting all kinds of different things that you have access to in terms of foods that you can buy, cooking methods that you can use. And most people, the average person, is just trying to get by. And I'm sure you've seen these videos where someone opens up their TikTok, they're eating eggs, and then they see a video and it says eggs are bad. And they're like, oh my God. And then they open up a video and it says vegetables are bad, and while they're eating a salad or something, and then it says, another video says meat is bad. And it's like, it gets to the point where everyone is so limited, and people just say everything is bad for you, and it's not that serious. I really don't think it's that serious. But those are my 3 criteria that I'm following, and I think if most people follow those, then they'll be fine. But saying all seed oils are bad is like saying all caffeine is bad. An analogy I like to use is coffee versus energy drinks. If you just drink coffee, like I drink black coffee, I don't put a bunch of stuff in it. I don't put a bunch of sugar in it or cream or anything. I just drink black coffee because I'm drinking it for the utility. I'm drinking it for the caffeine. But there are people that drink a bunch of energy drinks. They drink 3 or 4 energy drinks, and those energy drinks are not just caffeine. They come with all kinds of different chemicals in them, and they come with other products like vasodilators and such that might help people during a workout. And so, you have to be aware that when you're drinking an energy drink, you're not just getting the caffeine. And I view the seed oils very much the same. As long as they meet my 3 criteria, it's like I'm drinking my black coffee. If they don't meet those 3 criteria, then to me, it's more so like an energy drink. It's going to come with oxidized byproducts, and it's going to get incorporated in my cell membranes, making my cell membranes potentially more susceptible to heat and damage. But that's my stance. I hope that I've done a good enough job of laying out the Steelman pro and anti seed oil. Again, this is not a hill that I'm willing to die on, and I will continue to monitor the situation. And I'm constantly reading studies and trying to keep up with all this stuff. And so my opinion very much could change in the next 6 months or the next couple of years. We'll see. But as it stands now, I'm not too concerned with it as long as I control what I can control. And that's what I think that most people should do. But if you're still here watching, I appreciate you. My name is Randall James. I'm a strength and running coach, and I just like to do research on a lot of these different topics. It's fun to me. It's fun learning. And I think we need more people out there kind of laying things out in this way where they talk about both sides of the argument instead of just fear mongering, like why exactly is something bad? You need to go deep on it, because if you don't, you should be able to argue both sides of any, like if you get in an argument with someone, you should understand their argument. You should try and be good faith and try to argue their argument back to them and steelman it, because if you can't argue their position, then you don't understand their position. And so they could potentially know some things that you don't know. So I think it's good to just be good faith in the first place and try to just learn as much as you can about a position before you come to an actual position. People are just so lightning quick in forming an opinion about something. But anyways, that's it for me. If you are interested in coaching of any kind, either strength training or running, then feel free to email me at randall@alwaysadaptive.com. And you can find me on all social media. If you just type in Always Adaptive, I should pop right up. But I appreciate you once again. Make sure you hit that like and subscribe button, and I will see you at the next one.